I was only 7 years old when I witnessed the most heartbreaking sound I had ever heard in my young life. It was the kind of crying that reached deep into your chest and twisted something inside you, making you feel sick and helpless all at once. The sound was coming from behind the old Henderson house, the one that had been empty since Mrs. Henderson passed away the winter before. My bicycle had gotten a flat tire just as I was riding past that creepy old place, and as I knelt down to examine the punctured wheel, that's when I heard it. A whimpering so desperate, so full of pain and loneliness that it made my 7 year old heart break into a million pieces. What I discovered that day would change not only my life forever, but would also bring together two broken souls in the most unexpected way possible. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? My name is Emma, and this story takes place in the small town of Millbrook, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. I lived with my grandmother after my parents died in a car accident when I was 5. Grandma Rose was the kindest woman in the world, but she was getting older, and sometimes I felt like I was taking care of her more than she was taking care of me. I spent most of my time alone, riding my pink bicycle around the quiet neighborhoods, exploring places that adults told me to stay away from. The Henderson house was one of those places. It sat at the end of Elm Street like a sad, forgotten memory, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden that had once been the pride of the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson had been like a second grandmother to me before she got sick. She used to give me cookies and let me help her tend to her roses. After she died, her nephew from the city was supposed to take care of the property, but he never came around. The house just sat there, empty and slowly falling apart, while the town waited for someone to decide what to do with it. That October afternoon was unusually warm for the season, with golden leaves dancing in the gentle breeze. I had been riding my bike in circles around the neighborhood, practicing the tricks my friend Jake had taught me when I decided to venture down Elm Street. I wasn't supposed to go there alone, but Grandma Rose was napping and I was bored. The flat tire happened right in front of the Henderson house, as if fate had planned it that way. As I crouched down to look at the nail that had punctured my tire, the whole world seemed to go quiet except for that heartbreaking sound coming from somewhere behind the house. At first I thought it might be a baby crying, but as I listened more carefully, tilting my head the way Grandma Rose did when she was trying to hear the television, I realized it was something else, something animal, something in terrible pain. My hands were shaking as I left my bicycle on the sidewalk and crept toward the side of the house. Grandma Rose had always told me to stay away from stray animals because they might be sick or scared, but this sound was different. This wasn't the sound of something dangerous. This was the sound of something desperate. The side gate was hanging off its hinges, creaking softly in the October breeze. I had to push aside thick brambles that caught on my school sweater, leaving tiny thorns embedded in the yellow fabric that Grandma Rose had bought for me at the beginning of the school year. The smell hit me first, a mixture of decay, neglect, and something else that made my nose wrinkle and my eyes water. The backyard was even more overgrown than the front. Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses had grown wild and thorny, creating a jungle of green and brown that almost hid the old garden shed. The wooden structure was leaning to one side now, its roof covered in moss and fallen branches. Weeds grew as tall as my waist, and fallen leaves covered everything like a thick, rustling carpet that crunched under my small feet with each careful step. An old bird bath sat tilted and cracked near what had once been a flower bed, now overrun with thistle and dandelions. The crying sound was getting louder as I moved deeper into the forgotten garden, more desperate and heartbreaking with each step I took toward its source. But there, in the far corner where the property met the neighbor's fence, I saw something that made my stomach twist into knots and my 7-year-old heart skip several beats. A small, dark shape huddled against the wooden fence posts. As I got closer, stepping carefully through the tangled weeds, and trying not to make any sudden movements, the shape began to take form. It was a puppy, a German Shepherd puppy, but not the kind of proud, strong dog I had seen in picture books or at the park with other families. This baby was so thin I could see every single rib through its matted, dirty fur that looked like it hadn't been brushed or cleaned in months. Its eyes were closed, and it was making that terrible whimpering sound that had drawn me here in the first place, a sound so broken and desperate that it seemed to come from the very depths of its small soul. Around its neck was a heavy chain, much too big for such a small animal. The links were thick and rusted, the kind of chain that might be used to secure a boat or hold down heavy equipment. It was attached to a thick metal stake that someone had driven deep into the hard ground with brutal efficiency. The puppy couldn't move more than a few feet in any direction, and the area around the stake was worn down to bare dirt from endless pacing in desperate circles, trying to find some comfort, some escape, some hope that never came. There was no food bowl anywhere in sight, no water dish, even though the October sun had been beating down mercilessly for days. No shelter from the rain or sun or cold nighttime temperatures. No blanket or soft place to rest its aching body. Just this baby animal, chained up and forgotten like an old piece of furniture, slowly dying behind an abandoned house where no one would think to look, where no one would hear its cries for help. The ground around the stake was littered with evidence of the puppy's suffering, small piles of waste that the poor creature had been forced to step in and sleep next to, patches of fur that had been pulled out in desperate attempts to escape the chain, scratch marks in the hard earth where tiny claws had tried to dig deep enough to somehow find freedom underground. I knelt down in the damp leaves, my school dress getting dirty and torn on the thorns, but I didn't care about anything except the broken creature in front of me. The puppy's eyes opened when it sensed me nearby, and I gasped so loudly that a nearby crow took flight in alarm at what I saw reflected in those beautiful amber orbs. Those eyes were the most beautiful amber color I had ever seen, like the maple syrup Grandma Rose poured on my pancakes on Sunday mornings, like the golden leaves that danced outside my bedroom window in autumn, like liquid sunshine trapped in crystal. But they were also filled with a sadness so deep and profound that it made my own eyes fill with hot tears that spilled down my cheeks and dripped onto my dirty dress. The sadness in those amber eyes wasn't just pain from physical suffering, though that was certainly there. It was the kind of soul-deep despair that comes from having your trust in the world completely shattered. It was the look of someone who had given up hope, who had stopped believing that good things could happen, who had learned that crying for help only resulted in more silence and abandonment. But underneath that sadness, buried deep but still flickering like a candle in a windstorm, I could see something else, a tiny spark of curiosity, of wonder, of desperate hope that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this human wouldn't walk away. Maybe this human would care. The puppy tried to lift its head when it saw me, but the effort was too much for its weakened body. Instead, it just watched me with those heartbreaking amber eyes, as if trying to decide whether I was another source of pain, or maybe, possibly something different, something that might actually help instead of hurt. The chain had done terrible damage to its small neck. Where the heavy metal links had rubbed against tender skin for weeks or months, there were raw, angry wounds that looked infected and painful. Some were old scars, white and raised, while others were fresh cuts still seeping with infection. The fur had been completely worn away in a collar-shaped band around its throat, leaving exposed skin that was red and swollen, and obviously causing constant agony. "Hey, little baby," I whispered, my voice shaky with emotion and barely audible above the sound of wind through the dead leaves. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise I won't hurt you." My words seemed to hang in the air between us, carrying a weight and significance that I was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel in the deepest part of my heart. The puppy's ears twitched at the sound of my voice, and its tail made the tiniest movement. Not a real wag, but maybe the memory of what wagging used to feel like. I sat there for what felt like hours, just talking softly to the puppy and trying not to cry. Up close, I could see how bad things really were. The chain had rubbed the fur away from around the puppy's neck, leaving angry red marks that looked painful and infected. Its nose was dry and cracked. Its coat was matted with mud and things I didn't want to think about. But the worst part was how still the puppy was. It didn't try to come toward me, even though I could see in its eyes that it wanted to. It just lay there, as if it had learned that moving only brought more pain, that hoping for good things was a waste of energy it couldn't afford to spend. I knew I had to get help, but I also knew that leaving felt like abandoning this baby all over again. What if someone came and moved it while I was gone? What if it died while I was trying to find an adult who would believe me? My 7-year-old mind raced through possibilities. I could run home and tell Grandma Rose, but she moved slowly these days, and I wasn't sure she would be able to help with something this serious. I could call the police, but I had heard grown-ups talking about how busy they were with more important things. Then I remembered Mr. Johnson. He lived 3 streets over in a small house behind the grocery store, in a neighborhood where the houses were older and smaller, but well maintained by people who took pride in what little they had. All the kids in the neighborhood whispered about him because he walked with a pronounced limp and sometimes got a faraway look in his eyes that made adults lower their voices when they talked about him. Some of the older kids said he had been a soldier and that war had made him different, broken in ways that couldn't be seen but were there nonetheless. I had heard the grown-ups talking about him in hushed tones at church and in the grocery store checkout lines. They spoke about nightmares and flashbacks, about how he sometimes stood in his backyard at 3 in the morning, just staring at the sky, about how he had lost weight since coming home and seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Mrs. Patterson from down the street had mentioned that he rarely smiled anymore, that the young man who had left for deployment had been replaced by someone older and sadder when he returned. But I also remembered how gentle he had been the time my ball rolled into his yard and he brought it back to me, kneeling down to my height and speaking in a soft voice that made me feel safe instead of scared. How he always said hello when he saw me riding my bike, even when other adults seemed too busy or distracted to notice a kid. How he had helped Mrs. Garcia carry her groceries when her arthritis was acting up, asking for nothing in return. How he had the saddest eyes I had ever seen on a grown-up, almost as sad as the puppy's eyes, as if he understood what it felt like to be lost and hurting. There was something about the quiet way he moved through the world, like he was trying not to take up too much space or cause any trouble. Something about the careful way he spoke to people, as if he was afraid his words might accidentally cause harm. Something about the way he looked at stray cats and injured birds that made me think he understood suffering in a way that other adults didn't. If anyone would understand about saving something that was hurting, if anyone would know how to help a creature that had been abandoned and betrayed, it would be Mr. Johnson. I was sure of it with the absolute certainty that only a 7-year-old can possess. I stood up on shaky legs, my knees grass-stained and my heart pounding. I reached out slowly and touched the top of the puppy's head with just my fingertips, the way Grandma Rose had taught me to pet cats. The fur was softer than I expected under all the dirt and tangles. "I have to go get help," I whispered, "but I promise I'm coming back. I promise I won't leave you here alone." The puppy's amber eyes followed my face as I spoke, and I could swear it understood every word I was saying. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, my legs pumping as I raced through the neighborhood toward Mr. Johnson's house. My flat bicycle forgotten, my scraped knees forgotten, everything forgotten except the memory of those amber eyes and the promise I had made. Mr. Johnson was sitting on his small front porch when I came tearing around the corner, probably looking like a wild child with my hair flying and my dress dirty from kneeling in the leaves. He stood up quickly when he saw me, his face concerned. "What's wrong, Emma?" he asked, and I was surprised that he knew my name. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, too fast and all jumbled together. There's a puppy behind the Henderson house, and it's chained up and it's dying, and there's no food or water, and it's so skinny and sad, and someone hurt it and left it there, and I don't know what to do. And I promised I would come back and help it, but I'm just a kid, and I need a grown up, and please, will you help me, please? Mr. Johnson's expression changed as I spoke, his eyes growing dark and serious in a way that reminded me why some of the other kids were afraid of him. But he wasn't scary to me in that moment. He was exactly what I needed. "Show me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Mr. Johnson moved faster than I expected for someone with a limp, his military training evident in the way he carried himself despite his injury. He grabbed a well-worn toolbox from inside his house, the metal surface covered with scratches and dents that spoke of years of use and care. As he followed me back through the neighborhood, I could see something changing in his demeanor, the same transformation I had noticed in soldiers in movies when they shifted from civilian to warrior mode. His eyes had become alert and focused, scanning our surroundings with the intensity of someone who had been trained to notice threats and dangers. His jaw was set in a hard line, and despite his limp, he moved with purpose and determination that made me feel safer just by being near him. We took shortcuts through yards and alleys that I knew like the back of my hand, past Mrs. Garcia's vegetable garden, and through the gap in the Hendersons' fence that I used when I wanted to avoid the busy street. Mr. Johnson followed without question, trusting my 7-year-old knowledge of the neighborhood's hidden pathways. When we reached the Henderson house, I pointed toward the backyard with a trembling finger, suddenly feeling shy and worried that maybe I had exaggerated how bad things were. Maybe the puppy wasn't as sick as I thought. Maybe I was just being dramatic, the way adults sometimes said kids were when they got upset about things that seemed small to grown-ups. But when we pushed through the overgrown weeds and Mr. Johnson saw the puppy chained in that bare patch of dirt, his whole body went rigid in a way that made the air around us feel electric with tension. He stopped walking so suddenly that I almost bumped into his back, and when I looked up at his face, I saw something there that made my stomach flip with a mixture of fear and recognition. Anger. Not anger at me, but anger so deep and fierce that it seemed to radiate from him like heat from a furnace on a cold winter day. His hands, which had been steady when he grabbed his toolbox, were now shaking with barely controlled rage. The muscles in his neck stood out like cords, and his breathing had become shallow and quick. But there was something else there, too. Something that took me a moment to recognize. Pain. The kind of pain that comes from seeing something that reminds you of your own worst experiences, your own moments of helplessness and despair. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice so quiet and controlled that it was somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. Each word was carefully measured, as if he was using all his willpower to keep his emotions in check. "I don't know," I whispered back, my own voice barely audible. "I just found him like this." For a long moment, Mr. Johnson stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the puppy's small form with an intensity that made me think he was seeing more than just one abused animal. He was seeing every injustice, every act of cruelty, every innocent victim he had been unable to save during his time as a soldier. Mr. Johnson knelt down beside the puppy, his movements careful and gentle despite the anger I could feel rolling off him. The puppy lifted its head slightly when this new person approached, those amber eyes trying to focus on another face. "Hey there, soldier," Mr. Johnson said softly, and something in his voice made both the puppy and me feel safer. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" He opened his toolbox and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters that looked massive and dangerous to my 7-year-old eyes. But when he positioned them carefully around the chain, avoiding the infected skin around the puppy's neck, his hands were completely steady. The chain snapped with a sharp crack that made me jump, but the puppy barely reacted. It was as if it couldn't quite believe that the weight that had held it prisoner for so long was actually gone. "There you go, buddy," Mr. Johnson murmured. "You're free now." But the puppy didn't move. It just lay there, staring up at Mr. Johnson with those amber eyes that seemed too old and sad for such a young animal. Mr. Johnson sat back on his heels, studying the puppy with the same intense focus I had seen him use when he was working on his truck in his driveway. His eyes took in every detail: the infected wounds, the visible ribs, the way the puppy's breathing was too shallow and too fast. "We need to get him to a vet," he said, but his voice was troubled. "This little guy is in bad shape. Real bad shape." He pulled off his jacket, a heavy canvas work coat that smelled like motor oil and something else I couldn't identify, and wrapped it gently around the puppy's shivering form. The little one didn't resist, just pressed against the warmth as if it was the first kindness it had known in months. "Can you help me carry him?" Mr. Johnson asked me. "I need you to support his head while I lift his body. Can you do that?" I nodded, even though my hands were shaking. I had never held anything so fragile, so close to breaking. As Mr. Johnson carefully scooped the puppy up, I cradled its head in my small hands, feeling the heat of fever burning through the matted fur. The walk to Mr. Johnson's truck felt like it took forever. Every step had to be careful, every movement gentle. The puppy's eyes stayed fixed on my face the whole time, and I kept whispering to it, telling it everything was going to be okay, even though I wasn't sure that was true. Mr. Johnson's truck was old and beat up, but the cab was clean and warm. He had me sit in the passenger seat with the puppy wrapped in his jacket on my lap while he drove to the emergency animal clinic on the other side of town. "What's your name, buddy?" I asked the puppy as we drove, stroking the soft fur behind its ears. "You need a name if you're going to get better." The puppy's amber eyes seemed to focus on my face when I spoke, and its tail made that tiny movement again. Not quite a wag, but something. "How about Scout?" I suggested. "You look like a scout to me." Mr. Johnson glanced over at us from the driver's seat, and I caught a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Scout's a good name," he said. "A strong name." Dr. Martinez had been the emergency veterinarian in our town for over 20 years, and in that time, she had seen every kind of animal cruelty case imaginable. She had treated dogs who had been used as bait in fighting rings, cats who had been tortured by cruel children, horses who had been starved and neglected by owners who saw them as property rather than living beings. But when Mr. Johnson carried Scout through the clinic doors, with me following close behind, still wearing my dirty and torn school dress, I saw her face go pale in a way that told me this case was particularly heartbreaking, even by her standards. The waiting room fell silent as we entered. A woman with a cat carrier stopped mid-sentence in her conversation with the receptionist. An elderly man holding a small terrier looked up from his magazine with concern etched across his weathered features. Even the other animals seemed to sense that something serious was happening. A golden retriever stopped panting and watched us with alert, worried eyes. "How long has this animal been chained up?" Dr. Martinez asked as she quickly cleared an examination table with efficient practice movements, sweeping aside paperwork and medical supplies to make room for Scout's small, broken body. "We don't know exactly," Mr. Johnson replied, his voice still tight with controlled anger. "Emma found him about an hour ago. Based on his condition, the muscle atrophy, the extent of the wounds, I'd guess weeks, maybe months." Dr. Martinez's hands moved quickly and efficiently as she began her preliminary examination, but I could see the anger building in her expression, just like it had in Mr. Johnson's. It was professional anger, the kind that comes from seeing too much unnecessary suffering, from having to witness the worst that humans can do to innocent creatures who depend on them for care and protection. The examination room was bright and sterile, smelling of disinfectant and something medicinal that made my nose wrinkle. Scout, I had already decided that was his name, lay perfectly still during the examination, as if he had learned through bitter experience that struggling only made things worse, that resistance only brought more pain. When Dr. Martinez gently probed the infected wounds around his neck, checking their depth and severity, Scout didn't even whimper. That silence was somehow more heartbreaking than any amount of crying would have been. It spoke of a spirit that had been broken so thoroughly that even basic responses to pain had been suppressed. She examined his thin body with gentle but thorough hands, feeling for broken bones, checking his vital signs, looking into his eyes and ears with small instruments that cast bright light into dark places. Each discovery seemed to deepen her frown and tighten the lines around her eyes. Severe malnutrition, Dr. Martinez said, speaking more to herself than to us. Dehydration, multiple infections, possible internal damage from prolonged starvation. And this, she touched the raw skin around Scout's neck where the chain had rubbed away the fur. This is going to require extensive treatment. She looked up at Mr. Johnson, her expression serious. This is going to be expensive, very expensive, and there's no guarantee. I'll pay for it, Mr. Johnson said immediately. Whatever it costs. Dr. Martinez nodded and began setting up an IV line. I need to keep him here for at least a week, maybe longer. The next 24 hours are critical. I felt tears starting to blur my vision as I watched Scout lying so still on that cold metal table. He looked even smaller under the bright clinic lights, even more fragile than he had seemed in the backyard. Can I stay with him? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Both adults looked at me with surprise, as if they had forgotten I was there. Dr. Martinez glanced at Mr. Johnson, who nodded. For a little while, she said gently, but he needs to rest, and you probably need to get home to your grandmother. I spent the next hour sitting beside Scout's recovery kennel, talking to him in the soft voice that seemed to comfort him. Mr. Johnson had called Grandma Rose to explain where I was, and she had given permission for me to stay until evening as long as Mr. Johnson drove me home afterward. Scout's eyes tracked my movements whenever I shifted in my chair, as if he was afraid I might disappear like everyone else in his young life had. The fourth tube in his front leg looked huge and uncomfortable, but he didn't try to pull at it. He just watched me with those amber eyes that seemed to hold more sadness than any baby animal should ever have to carry. Dr. Martinez came to check on him every 20 minutes, adjusting medications and monitoring his vital signs. Each time she approached, I held my breath, waiting for bad news. But slowly, gradually, Scout began to respond to the treatment. His breathing became less labored. His eyes seemed a little brighter. You're going to be okay, I whispered to him, my face pressed close to the kennel door. I promise you're going to be okay. Mr. Johnson and I are going to take care of you. At the sound of Mr. Johnson's name, Scout's ears twitched slightly. It was the first real response he had shown to anything since we brought him in. Mr. Johnson had been pacing the waiting room, his limp more pronounced when he was agitated. Every few minutes he would come over to check on Scout and me, his weathered face creased with worry. You know, he said quietly, settling into the chair beside mine, I had a dog when I was deployed overseas. A stray that showed up at our base camp one day, half starved and scared of everything. The guys in my unit called him Trooper. I looked up at him, surprised. Mr. Johnson never talked about his time as a soldier, at least not that I had ever heard. What happened to Trooper? I asked. Mr. Johnson was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on Scout's small form. We took care of him, fed him, gave him a safe place to sleep. He became our mascot, our good luck charm. That dog saved our lives more than once, alerting us to dangers we couldn't see. His voice grew softer. When my tour ended, I had to leave him behind. It's one of the things I've regretted ever since. I looked back at Scout, understanding something that I was too young to put into words, but old enough to feel in my heart. Sometimes people needed to save something in order to save themselves. As evening approached, Dr. Martinez assured us that Scout was stable enough to leave for the night. His vital signs were improving, and the IV fluids were already helping to combat the severe dehydration. But the next few days would be critical for his recovery. Mr. Johnson drove me home, just as the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. Grandma Rose was waiting on the front porch, her face creased with worry that smoothed into relief when she saw me climbing out of the truck. "Emma Marie, you scared me half to death," she said, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like lavender and the chicken soup she had been making for dinner. "Mr. Johnson told me what you found. That poor little creature." Mr. Johnson walked me to the door, his toolbox still in his hand from the rescue earlier that day. "Mrs. Patterson," he said to my grandmother, "I want you to know that Emma did exactly the right thing today. She probably saved that puppy's life." Grandma Rose looked down at me with pride and concern mixed together in her expression. "She's always had a tender heart for creatures in need," she said. "Gets it from her mother." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Scout's amber eyes looking up at me from that cold examination table. I wondered if he was scared, sleeping alone in the clinic. I wondered if he understood that people were trying to help him now, or if he still expected only pain and abandonment. Around midnight, I heard the soft sound of Grandma Rose's slippers in the hallway. She appeared in my doorway, silhouetted by the hall light. "Can't sleep either?" she asked gently. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. She came and sat on the edge of my bed, smoothing my hair with her soft, wrinkled hand. "You did a brave thing today, sweetheart. A very brave thing." "Is Scout going to be okay?" I asked, the words coming out small and scared. Grandma Rose was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, honey, but I do know that he has a much better chance now than he did this morning. And that's because you didn't just walk away when you heard him crying. Word about Scout's rescue spread through our small town faster than I expected, carried by the same networks of church groups, coffee shop conversations, and backyard fence discussions that spread all important news in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. By the next morning, when Mr. Johnson picked me up to visit the clinic before school, Dr. Martinez told us that her phone had been ringing constantly since word got out. She had received over a dozen phone calls from people wanting to help with the medical expenses, including several from families I didn't even know cared about animals. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived next door to Grandma Rose, had called to offer $20 from her Social Security check. The teenagers who worked at the ice cream parlor had taken up a collection and raised $63 in a single afternoon. Even more surprising was the call from the Henderson family's former neighbors. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 houses down from the abandoned property, had called to apologize and explain that she had heard crying from behind the abandoned house several times over the past few weeks, but had assumed it was cats fighting or maybe raccoons in the garbage. The guilt in her voice was evident even as Dr. Martinez relayed the conversation to us. Mr. Petrov, the man who lived directly next to the Henderson house, had been even more upset when he learned the truth. He had also heard the crying, but had convinced himself it wasn't his responsibility to investigate. Now he was offering to pay for Scout's food and supplies once he was well enough to leave the clinic, and he had already called the city to report the abandoned property as a health hazard. The local newspaper had somehow gotten wind of the story and wanted to run a front-page article about the rescue, complete with photographs and interviews. They had called Dr. Martinez's office 3 times, each time more insistent about the human interest angle of the story. But Mr. Johnson politely declined their requests when Dr. Martinez asked if he would speak with them. "This isn't about getting attention," he told the reporter, who eventually called him directly at home. "This is about doing what's right. That animal doesn't need to be turned into a spectacle. He needs to heal." The reporter persisted, explaining how stories like this could raise awareness about animal abuse and potentially prevent future cases. But Mr. Johnson was firm in his refusal, and I could hear in his voice the same protective instinct that had driven him to help Scout in the first place. Even our school got involved when my teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, heard about the rescue from Grandma Rose. She organized a classroom discussion about animal welfare and responsible pet ownership that became so engaging that the principal asked her to present it to the entire third grade. The students were fascinated by the story and began asking their parents about adopting rescue animals. The ripple effects were spreading wider than any of us had expected, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would take months to fully understand. Scout looked slightly better that morning. His eyes seemed brighter, and when Dr. Martinez approached his kennel, he actually lifted his head instead of just lying motionless. When he saw me, his tail made that tiny movement that was almost a wag. "Hey, Scout," I whispered, pressing my face close to the kennel door. "I'm back, just like I promised." This time, Scout actually moved toward the sound of my voice, shifting his weight so he was closer to the front of the kennel. It was the first voluntary movement he had made since the rescue. Dr. Martinez smiled as she watched our interaction. "He's responding well to the treatment," she said. "His infections are already starting to clear up, and he's keeping food down. But the emotional healing is going to take much longer than the physical recovery." After school that day, and every day for the rest of the week, Mr. Johnson picked me up and drove me to the clinic to visit Scout. Each day brought small improvements. Scout began eating more eagerly. He started lifting his head when people approached. By the fourth day, he was actually sitting up in his kennel. But the biggest breakthrough came on Friday afternoon. I was sitting beside his kennel, reading him a story from one of my library books, when Scout actually pressed his nose against the wire door, not just shifting toward me, but actively seeking contact. I carefully extended my finger through the wire, and Scout sniffed it cautiously before giving it the gentlest lick I had ever felt. His tongue was warm and slightly rough, and the simple contact made my heart feel like it might burst with happiness. After 10 days in the clinic, Dr. Martinez finally declared Scout well enough to be discharged. He had gained 8 pounds. His infections had cleared up, and his coat was beginning to grow back where the chain had rubbed it away. But most importantly, he was beginning to show signs of the playful, curious puppy he was meant to be. The question was where he would go. Mr. Johnson had been paying for all of Scout's medical care, but he had never said anything about keeping him permanently. I had been hoping every night that somehow Scout could come live with Grandma Rose and me, but our apartment was small, and Grandma Rose was already struggling to take care of both of us. On the morning of Scout's discharge, Mr. Johnson appeared at our front door earlier than usual, looking nervous in a way I had never seen before. He asked to speak with Grandma Rose privately, and they talked in hushed voices in the kitchen while I waited anxiously in the living room. When they emerged, both of them were smiling. "Emma," Grandma Rose said, sitting down beside me on the couch, "Mr. Johnson has asked if you would like to help him take care of Scout. He's going to keep him at his house, but he wants you to be involved in Scout's care every day after school." I looked back and forth between them, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. "If it's okay with your grandmother," Mr. Johnson said, his voice gentler than I had ever heard it, "I'd like you to be Scout's co-parent. He trusts you, and honestly, I think you two need each other." That afternoon, we brought Scout home to Mr. Johnson's small house behind the grocery store. Mr. Johnson had spent the previous week puppy-proofing his space, setting up a comfortable bed near the window where Scout could watch the street, and buying toys and supplies that Dr. Martinez had recommended. Scout was nervous during the car ride, pressing himself against my side and trembling slightly. But when we carried him into Mr. Johnson's living room and set him down on the soft carpet, something magical happened. For the first time since I had found him chained behind the Henderson house, Scout's tail wagged. Really wagged. not just that tiny movement that was barely perceptible. His whole body seemed to relax as he took in the warm, safe environment that was going to be his new home. Mr. Johnson had bought a collar to replace the heavy chain that had caused so much damage. It was soft red leather with Scout's name embroidered in gold letters. When we put it on him, Scout sat perfectly still, as if he understood that this collar was different. This one meant belonging instead of captivity. That first week established the routine that would define the next several months. I would go to school in the morning, but every afternoon, Mr. Johnson would pick me up and drive me to his house where Scout would be waiting by the window, watching for our arrival. The transformation was gradual but steady. Scout learned to play with toys, though he was gentle and cautious at first, as if he couldn't quite believe they wouldn't be taken away. He learned to sleep without flinching at every sound. He learned that food bowls were filled regularly and that he didn't need to guard every morsel. Most importantly, he learned to trust, not just Mr. Johnson and me, but the world in general. He began wagging his tail when strangers approached instead of cowering. He started exploring the backyard with curiosity instead of fear. Scout's rescue had effects that reached far beyond just the three of us. Mr. Johnson, who had been withdrawn and isolated since returning from deployment, began to engage more with the community. People who had previously whispered about the sad war veteran began to see him differently when they witnessed his gentle patience with Scout and his kindness toward me. The local animal shelter reached out to Mr. Johnson, asking if he would consider fostering other dogs who had been traumatized by abuse or neglect. They had heard about his success with Scout and thought his quiet, patient approach might be exactly what other damaged animals needed. For me, caring for Scout taught me lessons about responsibility, compassion, and the healing power of unconditional love that no classroom could have provided. I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show up day after day with patience and kindness. Grandma Rose often said that Scout had given both Mr. Johnson and me a sense of purpose that we had been missing. For Mr. Johnson, it was the chance to save something instead of watching it suffer. For me, it was the opportunity to be needed by someone who depended on my love and care. 6 months after the rescue, Scout was completely transformed. He had grown into his paws and filled out into the beautiful German Shepherd mix he was always meant to be. His coat was thick and shiny, his amber eyes bright with intelligence and mischief. Most amazingly, he had learned to play like the puppy he still was at heart. But the scars around his neck were still visible, thin white lines that would always remind us of where he had come from. Mr. Johnson said those scars were important, not because they represented Scout's suffering, but because they represented his survival. 3 months after Scout's rescue, the police finally tracked down the person responsible for chaining him behind the Henderson house. It turned out to be Mrs. Henderson's nephew, the one who was supposed to be taking care of the property. He had bought Scout as a guard dog for the empty house, but had quickly lost interest when the puppy proved to be friendly rather than aggressive. Instead of finding Scout a proper home, he had simply chained him up and abandoned him, expecting that someone else would eventually deal with the problem. When confronted by the police, he showed no remorse, claiming that Scout was just a mutt and that he had more important things to worry about. The nephew was charged with animal cruelty and neglect. The judge, who had heard about Scout's rescue and recovery, imposed the maximum penalty allowed by law: 6 months in jail, a substantial fine, and a lifetime ban on owning pets. But for Scout, Mr. Johnson, and me, the legal resolution was less important than the emotional one. Scout had found his forever family, and we had all found something we didn't even know we were looking for. 1 year after I first heard Scout crying behind the abandoned house, the three of us returned to Elm Street. The Henderson house had been demolished and replaced with a small park where children could play safely. A bench had been installed near where Scout had been chained, with a plaque that read, in memory of all animals who suffer in silence and in honor of those who speak for them. Scout, now fully grown and confident, sniffed around the area with interest, but no fear. The terrified broken puppy, who had once been chained to a stake in this very spot, was now a therapy dog who visited the children's hospital every week, bringing comfort to kids who were facing their own difficult battles. Mr. Johnson had officially adopted both Scout and me, though Grandma Rose remained very much a part of our extended family. The three of us had become an unlikely but perfect unit, bound together by the shared experience of rescue and recovery. As we sat on the memorial bench that afternoon, watching Scout play with the children in the new park, Mr. Johnson put his arm around my shoulders. You know, he said quietly, I spent a lot of years thinking that the war had broken something in me that could never be fixed, but Scout taught me something important about healing. What's that? I asked, leaning against his comfortable warmth. He taught me that sometimes being broken isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a different kind of strength. Scout trotted over to us then, his tail wagging and his amber eyes bright with joy. He dropped a tennis ball at my feet and sat down, looking up at me expectantly. Ready to play, ready to love, ready to trust that tomorrow would be better than yesterday. Today, 3 years after that first heartbreaking whimper changed all our lives forever, Scout has become something of a local celebrity, though he wears his fame with the same gentle dignity that characterizes everything he does. His story has inspired the creation of a rescue organization called Second Chances Animal Rescue that specializes in helping abused and abandoned animals find their way back to trust and love. Mr. Johnson serves as the organization's president, using his patience and deep understanding of trauma to help other damaged souls find their way back to hope. His military training in crisis management and his personal experience with recovery have made him uniquely qualified to handle the most difficult cases. Animals who have been so severely abused that traditional rescue methods simply don't work. The rescue organization operates out of a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, donated by a local businessman who was moved by Scout's story. The facility includes individual recovery kennels for animals who need quiet, private spaces to heal, as well as larger areas where socialized animals can play and interact with potential adopters. But the work extends far beyond just finding homes for animals. Mr. Johnson has developed a program that pairs rescue animals with veterans who are struggling with their own recovery from trauma. The mutual healing that occurs when two damaged souls find each other has proven to be remarkably effective for both species. I'm 10 years old now, and I volunteer at the rescue every weekend, helping to socialize puppies and kittens who have never known kindness, reading to shy animals who find comfort in the sound of a gentle human voice, and assisting with the basic care that helps these creatures remember what it feels like to be loved. Scout comes with me to every volunteer session, serving as a role model and therapy dog for animals who are just beginning their own healing journeys. His calm presence and gentle nature show them that humans can be trusted, that love is possible even after betrayal, that the future doesn't have to be defined by the past. Watching Scout work with newly rescued animals is like witnessing a master class in compassion and patience. He seems to understand exactly what each animal needs, whether it's space and silence, or gentle companionship, or playful encouragement. He has an intuitive ability to read fear and respond with exactly the right energy to help scared creatures take their first tentative steps toward trust. The success stories are mounting up in ways that still amaze all of us who work with the organization. There was Bella, the pit bull mix, who had been used as a bait dog and came to us so aggressive and terrified that she couldn't be touched by human hands. Scout spent hours sitting quietly outside her kennel, never approaching, never pressuring, just being a calm, reassuring presence until she finally allowed him to come close. There was Max, the elderly German shepherd who had been abandoned when his family moved and left him chained in their backyard. for weeks before neighbors reported the situation. He was so depressed when he arrived that he wouldn't eat or lift his head to acknowledge anyone's presence. Scout somehow recognized a kindred spirit and managed to coax Max back to life with gentle persistence and what can only be described as canine counseling. The work isn't always easy. Some animals are too damaged to fully recover. Others find homes only to be returned when their new families realize that healing takes patience and commitment. But for every success story, for every animal that learns to wag its tail again or purr with contentment, Scout's legacy grows a little stronger. Mr. Johnson often says that Scout saved his life as much as we saved Scouts. The purpose and meaning that came from caring for a creature who had suffered helped him find his way back from the dark place where war had left him. The daily routine of walks and feeding and gentle training gave structure to days that had once felt empty and endless. For me, Scout taught lessons about courage and compassion that shaped who I'm becoming. He showed me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen for the cries that others ignore, to stop when everyone else keeps walking, to care when it would be easier to look away. As I write this story, Scout is sleeping in a patch of sunlight by my bedroom window, his breathing deep and peaceful in the way that only comes to creatures who know they are completely safe and unconditionally loved. His food bowl is full of the premium nutrition that helps maintain his healthy weight. His water is fresh and clean, changed twice daily, because Mr. Johnson believes that even small details matter when you're caring for someone you love. His favorite toys are scattered around him: a rope that he likes to shake, a tennis ball that squeaks when he bites it, a stuffed duck that he carries around when he's feeling particularly content. He is surrounded by love and safety and the absolute certainty that he will never be abandoned again, never chained up and forgotten, never left to cry alone in the darkness while the world passes by without noticing his suffering. Sometimes I think about that 7-year-old girl who heard crying behind an abandoned house and decided to investigate instead of riding away on her pink bicycle. I wonder what would have happened if I had been too scared or too busy or too convinced that someone else would handle it. The thought makes me hold Scout a little tighter and appreciate even more deeply the miracle of second chances and the power of small acts of courage. I think about how many other children might walk past suffering every day, either because they don't know how to help or because they've been taught that it's not their responsibility. I think about how many adults do the same thing, assuming that someone else will step up, that someone else will make the difficult phone call or take the time to investigate a suspicious situation. But mostly I think about the future and all the possibilities that stretch out before us like an infinite horizon full of hope and purpose. About all the animals who are still chained up in forgotten places, still crying for help that may never come unless someone chooses to listen and act. About all the people who are walking past those cries because they don't know how to listen, or they don't believe they can make a difference, or they're too wrapped up in their own problems to notice someone else's suffering. Scout's story isn't just about one puppy who was rescued from abuse and neglect by a kind war veteran and a determined little girl. It's about the power of compassion to transform lives in ways that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. It's about the healing that happens when broken souls find each other and discover that they're stronger together than they ever could be apart. It's about the profound truth that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. Every animal who finds a loving home because of our rescue organization carries a piece of Scout's legacy forward into the world. Every veteran who finds purpose and healing in caring for traumatized animals extends the chain of redemption that began with one crying puppy and one determined little girl who refused to walk away. Every child who learns to listen for suffering and respond with courage helps build a world where fewer creatures have to endure the kind of abandonment and abuse that Scout survived. The work continues day after day, rescue after rescue, life after life. Sometimes the victories are large and obvious. A severely abused animal who learns to trust again, A veteran who finds his way back from the darkness of trauma, a family who discovers the joy of giving a second chance to a creature who desperately needs one. But more often, the victories are small and quiet. A tail that wags for the first time in months, a frightened animal who allows itself to be touched, a moment of connection that bridges the gap between species and reminds us all that love is the most powerful force in the universe. The sound that haunts me now isn't that heartbreaking whimper that first drew me to Scout behind the abandoned house on Elm Street. It's the sound of his tail thumping against the floor when I come home from school, rhythmic and joyful like a drum announcing that all is well in his world. It's the sound of his contented sighs when he settles down for a nap in his favorite sunny spot, secure in the knowledge that he will wake up surrounded by love. It's the sound of children laughing when he visits the hospital and shows them that healing is possible, that broken things can be mended, that tomorrow can be better than today. That sound, that beautiful sound of joy and love and trust rebuilt from the ashes of despair, will echo in my heart for the rest of my life. And every time I hear it, I'll remember that sometimes the most important rescues are the ones where everyone involved gets saved, where the act of saving someone else becomes the thing that saves you, where love multiplies instead of divides and makes everyone stronger and more whole than they were before. And I'll remember that it all started with a 7-year-old girl who chose to listen when she heard something crying in the darkness, who chose courage over comfort, who chose to act instead of walking away. Because in the end, that's how the world gets healed. One rescue at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one broken heart learning to trust again at a time.